what is one of the possible explanations for the cause of the Civil War while saying that slavery is involved? Abby.
Slavery moving westward.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So it's not just that slavery exists in the United States, it's the fact that slavery continues to march westward, and that continues to exacerbate the differences between North and South, the growing abolitionist feeling in the North, the growing sentiment of let's not even talk about it in the South, and that this ultimately drives a wedge between North and South that is irreconcilable short of war. Okay, that's one possibility. What's another possibility? Kaylee.
Is it slaves showing up in like the 1600s?
Yeah, exactly. Slaves showed up in 1619, bam, Civil War was bound to happen. I don't think that's a very good argument at all, but there are some who make the argument. Okay, and then what's the other one? Abby.
Wasn't it that it's like in the it was in the Constitution?
Yes, our nation was founded with slavery as a recognized part of it. It's in the Constitution. And so the Civil War was bound to happen because it was a part of the fabric of the nation. And when you basically try to tear out slavery, you're tearing out a piece of the fabric of the nation, and there will be, of course, a tear in that fabric, to continue with that metaphor. Which of those arguments, somebody else, have I been arguing?
That it was the expansion of slavery that was really what made it inevitable. Yes,
that's exactly right. It's the expansion of slavery. That's what I've been arguing. And the major piece of that, of course, you kind of limp along through the 1820s with the Missouri Compromise, and you're limping along. But it's really not until you get to the Mexican War and the Mexican Cession that this becomes a major issue. And the Compromise of 1850 is made possible because of this concept that is introduced and encouraged by Stephen Douglas. What is that concept? Kaylee.
Popular sovereignty.
Popular sovereignty. I keep going back to this. You guys have to be familiar with the concept of popular sovereignty. Rather than Washington and the Senate drawing the map and saying, well, this state's going to be slave and this state is going to be free, popular sovereignty is introduced because California wants to come in as a free state. And it allows the states and the territories to decide for themselves, essentially, if they're going to be slave or free. Okay, and so the 1850s becomes a very, very difficult time. Compromise of 1850 allows for the nation to continue on, for California to come in, but it does two other things. It introduces popular sovereignty, and that's going to be an issue in Kansas, which we'll see in a minute. And the other thing is the strengthened fugitive slave law. Now, if you want to be an escaped slave, you have to go all the way to where? All the way up to Canada. If you are found in Kentucky, or I guess Kentucky, or even Indiana or Ohio, New York, if you're found as an escaped slave there, what is required? It's required that you get shipped back to your owner. Okay, so we've talked about all these different things that sort of lead up to this. Keep in mind that these things on the screen, they're not all equal in importance. Some of these things have more importance than other things. And I would say that the annexation of Texas and the Mexican Cession after the end of the war is that major piece. Like we never quite get past that in terms of potential conflict. Additionally, you have other societal things like Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. We've talked already a little bit about Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was initially published in little chunks in newspapers. It was put together in a book and released in 1852. It's a fictional story about a guy named Uncle Tom. Queen Victoria, when she reads this, weeps over it. Many Americans in the North buy it. It's second in popularity only to the Bible in terms of sales. And in the South, what do they do with it? Two things. They ban it and they burn it. And this, of course, is to keep this abolitionist sentiment in the South down to absolutely nothing and make sure that people don't actually talk about it. If you have even plantation owners talking about the concept of abolitionism that's going on in the North and slaves overhear it, what ideas are going to be put into those slaves' heads? Abolition. And the South wants to keep a lid on that as much as possible. We sometimes will talk about slave culture. Typically, I'll do this in class, but I'm not going to talk about that at this point. Although I am going to be assigning a portion of a documentary film. It's actually a very good documentary by Ken Burns. It's called The Civil War, specifically the episode The Cause. You're going to watch just a portion of it. And in that, there's going to be a section on slave culture that I want you to pay attention to. I will also admit there is some images that are pretty harsh that show the backside of slaves that have been beaten, pretty gnarly, not something that's pleasant to look at. If that's something that you're uncomfortable with in the video, you can turn away or whatever. But that will be assigned as well. It's something that I think will be good for us to have its background before the DBQ is assigned on Thursday. Okay, so the concept of popular sovereignty has been established in the Mexican Cession in the Compromise of 1850. And so it's tried again in the Kansas-Nebraska Act, right? So Kansas wants to come in as a state, and they have a lot of people there, so they probably can. And so let them decide for themselves. Stephen Douglas again pushes this, right? Let them decide for themselves whether they want to be slave or free. Well, let's go back here really quickly to look at the map. Where is Kansas? If you go back to the old Missouri Compromise line, it's above it, right? It's right next to Missouri. It's above the line. And the abolitionists in the North have told themselves there's no place for slavery in a state like Kansas. Like it's plains. Like there's no cotton there. Slavery's not going to work there. So we don't have to worry about slavery expanding, even if potentially it could. Now all of a sudden, with the argument that's going on here, it looks like very well, slavery could expand up there. Because you have people from Missouri, they come rushing in, they try to interfere with the election to see whether Kansas is going to be slave or free, and they bring their guns, and then you have more people from the North, they come rushing in with their guns, and then all of a sudden people are shooting at each other to determine whether or not Kansas will come in as slave or free. And there are multiple reasons why the Southerners and the Missourians want Kansas to come in as a slave state, and there's many reasons, especially abolitionist ones, moral ones from the North, to keep it from coming in as a slave state. They want it to come in instead as a free state. And so popular sovereignty in practice isn't really working very good. And so let me be very clear here. Like, it's not just, Missourians and free Kansas people throw rocks at each other. They're shooting at each other. People are dying on the plains of Kansas. There's a guy named John Brown who kind of becomes a little bit of a northern hero. He is a free state settler in Kansas. He hates slavery. He has vowed to give his life to free the slaves in the South. And he leads a small group of men against a much larger group of men in Kansas, the Missourians. He fights the Missourians, and he's actually kind of victorious. Now they come back and they attack again, and he has to escape. But regardless, John Brown becomes a guy that has some fame in the North. Now, something that we learned later that we didn't know at the time, that he and his sons were so anti-slavery that he went to a next-door neighbor one time, while then they were pro-slavery people, and he and his sons dragged 5 of them out of their beds and hacked them to bits with broadswords. Yeah, John Brown. So that's just, and that's a specific example of the broader problems in Kansas going on during this time period. It's like a mini civil war that's not very well organized that's going on in Kansas before the Civil War. Okay, and so the influence of popular, and so then the question, of course, is, well, what does Kansas actually want? Here we have a political compromise, but on the ground it's not even. And what I'm going to be doing at this point is I'm going to be reading to you a little story. This is a little story that I pulled out of a book that I enjoy here on the coming of the Civil War. And it's about the violence that happens not in Kansas, but actually in Washington. I like a good political theater, and so this is definitely it, but it's a bit violent as well. by this time, people are wearing their guns potentially to the Senate and to the House of Representatives because the mood gets quite violent, at least after this. Kansas was bleeding. I'm going to be talking about. So you should have in your notes a little section that you could add notes to. I don't really care if you do, but I do want you to pay attention to what happens to this guy and why this is going on in Washington after the problems in Kansas. Kansas was bleeding. The fighting in Kansas caused a rather incredible ruckus in Washington. One very important northern senator, whose name was Charles Sumner from Massachusetts, had been growing angry about what he considered the crime against Kansas. In a two-day speech before the Senate, Sumner let his anger spew forth, much to the dismay of the Southerners present. "Those murderous robbers from Missouri," declared Sumner, "they are hirelings picked from the drunken spew and vomit of an uneasy civilization. They have committed rape of a virgin territory, compelling it to the hateful embrace of slavery." Now, by the way, that's pretty strong language, right? Imagine if the Republicans in Congress today were ranting about, the Democrats committing rape to whatever. It's not going to go over well, right? That's about as strong a language as you can use against the opposing side. However, Sumner is not content to leave his assault on kind of that broader political level, like, pro-slavery people, you're not, your ideas are bad. He has to jump right in and go after the people responsible. Not content to leave his assault on a political level, he insisted that those responsible for the Kansas-Nebraska legislation, certain senators, and some of those senators were in the Senate chamber when he said these things, were responsible personally for the bloodshed. His 3-hour oration took a very personal and cruel turn. Sumner said of Stephen Douglas of Illinois, who helped to come up with the concept of popular sovereignty, said, quote, "He was a noisome squat and nameless animal." That's great. Yeah. Imagine Ted Cruz calls someone like an animal. You're just an animal. You're a nameless animal, not a proper model for an American senator. Ooh. Most serious, though, was his extreme insult of South Carolina's Andrew P. Butler. Butler's manner of speech and physical mannerisms had been impaired by a stroke that Butler had suffered earlier, were directly mocked by Sumner. So yeah, the guy slurs the speech a little bit and is like, can't move his left side very good. And so yeah, there's Sumner is up there mocking all that. It's kind of like making fun of the handicapped kid in class. You just don't do it. But that's exactly what Sumner was doing. But it wasn't just the physical mannerisms that he mocked. Listen to what he said. "The senator from South Carolina has read many books of chivalry and believes himself a chivalrous knight with sentiments of honor and courage. Of course, he has chosen a mistress to whom he has made his vows, and who, though ugly to others, is always lovely to him. Though polluted in the sight of the whole world, she is chaste in his sight." I mean that whore, slavery. The Southern senators that heard this were horrified and outraged, and Southerners everywhere soon read it in the newspaper. Some wanted to challenge Sumner to a duel, but that would, of course, suggest that they were somehow social equals, and Sumner would decline because that's not really what you do in Massachusetts. Besides, someone as that low-down Yankee from Massachusetts deserved not a duel, but a horsewhipping, or perhaps a caning. So felt Congressman Preston Brooks, who was cousin of Andrew Butler. 2 days after Sumner's speech, Brooks, who was accompanied by another friend also from South Carolina named Lawrence Kite, walked into a nearly empty Senate chamber after adjournment and approached Sumner's desk, where Sumner was sitting writing some letters. "Mr. Sumner," said Brooks, "I have read your speech twice over carefully. It is an insult on South Carolina and Mr. Butler, who is a relative of mine." As Sumner began to respond by standing up, and he was 6 feet 4 inches tall, Brooks took out a gold-headed cane and brought it down upon Sumner's head, knocking Sumner back into the seat. Again, Brooks' cane came down upon Sumner's head, and again, Sumner fell beneath the desk and was trapped under the desk, which was bolted to the Senate floor. But Brooks continued to bash Sumner's head until he ripped the desk from the floor. By this time, Sumner was blinded by his own blood. He staggered up the aisle, grasping at the desks, and then collapsed, lapsing into unconsciousness immediately. Brooks followed Sumner to where he had collapsed and continued to beat Sumner until he broke his cane, then quietly left the Senate chamber. Several other senators during this time had attempted to help Sumner, but Kite had accompanied Brooks and sat there with his gun saying, "Leave him be." Sumner, surprisingly, did not die, but he suffered many, many headaches for years to come, as well as nightmares that were fairly severe. He was unable to attend the Senate for several years, yet Massachusetts legislature kept electing him, feeling that his empty Senate seat said a great deal about freedom of speech in America. Eventually, he does come back to the Senate, and he helps lead the Reconstruction effort to promote Black equality. So Sumner's an interesting guy. Now, how do you think the North felt about the South, a guy from the South beating a Northern senator? Freedom of speech, people. You don't like what someone says, it doesn't mean you get to beat them. Tell that to Antifa. Sorry, I just can't help it. How do you think Southerners felt? Believe it or not, many bought canes and had them shipped to Brooks. They felt he needed to keep up the good work. So he had many gifts of many canes. Pretty incredible that this was going on in the US Senate. So that shows, I think, the division here between North and South, where that sort of violence is able to go clear to the Senate. And it's not going to stop there, by the way. So let's talk now a little bit about the rise of a certain character from Illinois. He is a very well-spoken character. He was a Whig. He was elected originally, his name is Abraham Lincoln, to the House of Representatives in 1846. He opposes Mr. Polk's war. He is a very Whiggish sort of a guy. He opposes slavery personally, but when he runs for president, eventually he'll oppose. He doesn't like popular sovereignty either. He wants to put a law in place that says, look, slavery is where it is, but that's where it stops. It goes nowhere else. He's opposed to the extension of slavery, the expansion of slavery, but he's not calling for its immediate abolition. Meanwhile, of course, Stephen Douglas is the author of Popular Sovereignty, and so the two of them, when they run for the Senate, have a number of very, very interesting debates that really has become probably some of the best political discourse that America has to offer in our history. So if you're interested, you can read some of the debates. It's kind of interesting. And people would actually come to listen, and they last for a long time that they're arguing. And who ends up winning? Does anyone know? For the Senate. Well, if you don't know, I'll just tell you, it's not Lincoln, it's Douglas. Douglas retains his seat. Abraham Lincoln does not win. However, so going back to Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson is a Democrat. Is he loved by everybody? You can nod your head yes or no. Is Andrew Jackson loved by everybody? It's not a hard one to figure out. No, Andrew Jackson is hated by a very strong minority of Americans. And they have a whole new party arise in opposition to Andrew Jackson. What was the name of that party? I already told you, actually. It was the Whig Party. And the Whig Party runs Henry Clay and he loses, and they run Henry Clay and he loses, and then they run Tippecanoe and Tyler too, and finally they get a Whig in there, and of course that's William Henry Harrison. What happens to William Henry Harrison right after he takes office? He gets pneumonia and dies after a 2-hour speech in the rain. And then, of course, his vice president, Tyler. But how much of a Whig is Tyler? Well, the Whigs, they get majorities here. So it's that they have the House and they have the Senate and they have the presidency, and the president vetoes their entire agenda, even though he is a Whig. I mean, it'd be kind of like voting for Donald Trump as a Republican and have Republicans win both the House and the Senate, and they pass all the stuff, and Donald Trump's like, yeah, never mind, veto, 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 veto. That would not go over well. Okay, and so then the Democrats win again, and then eventually the Whigs do win, but he dies. Zachary Taylor dies. So, I mean, eventually the Whig Party just falls apart. And that's largely because you got the rise of these other parties like, well, the Free Soil Party and the Know Nothing Party and the Republican Party. And so by this time, by the time we're getting to the late 1850s, the Whig Party is pretty well dissolved, and the Republican Party is on the rise, but it's not necessarily a majority party, or even if you were to pick this party as the one that will arise in 1856, it may or may not be the one that's going to become important. They do run a presidential candidate in 1856, and who ends up winning in 1856? Who becomes president in 1857? Does anyone know what his name is? His name is James Buchanan. If you look at most historians' lists, James Buchanan ranks at the very bottom of good presidents. Like, he's the worst. And I'm not, just terrible. And that's largely because when the entire South secedes, he's still sitting as president. And he's like, well, what can you do? You're president. You can do something, right? Like commander-in-chief or commander and twiddle your thumbs. And that was very much James Buchanan. Oh, by the way, also, I don't know this for sure. James Buchanan was our only bachelor president, and he lived in Washington with another man for 20 years. And when he and this other dude would show up for parties together, they had a nickname because they were both pretty effeminate. And their names were Miss Nancy and Aunt Fancy. And I'm not sure if he was Aunt Fancy or Miss Nancy, but either way, many historians think that it's quite likely that James Buchanan was our only homosexual president. So anyway, there you go. Okay, moving on. So Abraham Lincoln's party is on the rise in 1856, and in 1860, surprise, surprise, the Republican Party will actually be victorious, winning not quite 40% of the vote. Might have been exactly 40% of the vote, but a very, very, Donald Trump won 49% of the vote and didn't become president, right? So that's a very large percentage of the vote. Okay, so let's talk now about the Dred Scott case. This angers Northerners very, very intensely. And let's discuss a little bit as to why that would be the case. So we're going to be testing the fugitive slave law that was put in place and strengthened with the Compromise of 1850. Dred Scott was a slave who had moved, I think, to Indiana or Ohio, or maybe it was Illinois, somewhere in there, that was a free state, and had lived with his master for like 10 years, and then his master died, and he's like, oh, I'm free, right? And of course, the family that still lived in the South of his owner wanted Dred Scott back. They said, well, he's worth something, and we want him back. And Dred Scott said, no, I'm free. And so then the court, the Supreme Court, which, by the way, now, which party tended to be more pro-slave, Democrats or Republicans at this time, or Democrats and Whigs? Which was the Southern party? It was the Democrats, right? The Democrats, Andrew Jackson's party. The Whigs were stronger in the North. They were for industry. The Democrats tended to be more for states' rights and agriculture. And that meant the Democrats at this point would be more in favor of slavery. Now, who has had control of the presidency more often, the Whigs or the Democrats? The Democrats, right? Jackson and Van Buren, you have one kind of hiccup there of William Henry Harrison and Tyler, but Tyler wasn't much of a Whig anyway. And then you have Polk, and then you have a hiccup of Taylor. And then in the 1850s, which Taylor is, and then he dies partway through, and you have one hiccup there, another little hiccup of Whigs, and that's it, done. And the rest are all Democrats. And so the Democrats, the presidents, are picking like pro-Southern, pro-slave Supreme Court justices. In fact, I believe at this time, 7 out of the 9 Supreme Court justices were very pro-slave, pro-Southern, including Roger B. Taney, who is still alive and at this point may have surpassed John C. Calhoun as the ugliest man ever. Yeah, is that bad. And he was Chief Justice at this point. Oh, by the way, we'll talk about Roger B. Taney with Jackson, I believe, put him there. Maybe it was Van Buren, but I think it was Jackson. Anyway, the court gives a ruling that is shocking. And it's shocking for a couple different reasons. But, you know, the Supreme Court could have said, okay, well, we recognize that Dred Scott is a human being, you know, or at least 3/5 of a person according to the Constitution. But under these circumstances, we're going to say that he still is a slave. But that's not what they did. They said that, firstly, slaves aren't people, and they have no right to sue. And so we shouldn't have even heard this case. That's how extreme their ruling is. Like, this case we shouldn't have even heard because he's not a person. And they have no rights whatsoever at all. They are property. Additionally, of course, he has to be sent back. And what this means, if you actually apply this philosophically, is that if you are a Southern slaveholder, say from North Carolina, and you're like, I feel like moving to Pennsylvania. Are your slaves still slaves in Pennsylvania? Based on this reasoning. Everyone pay attention here and either nod yes or no. Yes. Guys, the whole purpose here of the Republican Party, of Abraham Lincoln, of the abolitionists, at the very least, slavery needs to stop expanding. But what could potentially happen here? You see how big of a problem this is? Like, this theoretically could legalize slavery everywhere. Now, it wouldn't be recommended that if you're a slaveholder, you bring 100 slaves and move to Boston. What would the people in Boston do to you as a slaveholder? They might take you out and kill you and let your slaves free. But at the same time, if this is true, then it could be that basically a slave is a slave no matter where they go. And so potentially it doesn't matter if Pennsylvania says there are no slaves here. If the Supreme Court says that, yeah, you're still a slave if you're taken to Pennsylvania, then it looks like slavery could go everywhere. Do you see what I'm saying here? Like, slavery could literally go everywhere. At least theoretically. Maybe not practically, but theoretically it could go everywhere. And so the Dred Scott case is a huge case. So Dred Scott is going to be sent back. It's kind of even sadder here. A lot of abolitionists in the North are horrified by this. They raise funds for his freedom, and then he dies before he's able to be freed. Okay, moving here towards the end of the 1850s still, slavery is, of course, an industry in the United States, and several things starts happening that make so Kansas, we need to have Kansas be a slave state. If you're a Southerner, it's really important for you because of several different things. Firstly, because of the fact that the weather was really good in the 1850s and the mechanism by which the South was growing cotton was really pretty perfected at this point, they have bumper crops of cotton in 1855, 56, 57, 58. They've got extra cotton. And for those of you who like economics and familiar with economics, when you have a lot of a product that you're trying to sell, more than you really need, more than there's a market for, what happens to the prices? Okay, it goes down. And this is exactly what happened with cotton. And so the value of slaves, in order to sort of like bolster the economic strength of the South, needed to go up. And in order to make the value of the slave go up, you need to actually have slavery move to new places, because the places where slavery was, there was like saturated. Like, so we need Kansas to become a slave state so we can sell our slaves there and raise the price of slaves. We can't make money on cotton, let's make money selling slaves. Does that make sense? And so this is one of the reasons why the Missourian ruffians are so intense about making sure that Kansas and Nebraska are going to be slave places, right? Where slavery expands. And so to make matters even more difficult at this time, and slaves knew that this was the case. It's more likely because they're not making money on cotton, that the owners will sell some of their slaves, families will be broken up, and slave families did not want to be broken up. And so, the Underground Railroad, which we've already mentioned before, grows very incredibly during this time. So Harriet Tubman and the Quaker safe houses along the way get slaves who are afraid that because of these economic difficulties, whether they know that those economic difficulties are there or not, doesn't really matter. The truth is, the slaves know that they might be sold. They might be sold away from their families. And so they try to escape. And many slaves do escape through the Underground Railroad and go to Canada, right? Because the fugitive slave law is now strong, and they're going to have to be sent back if they're caught in America. And so this exacerbates the difficulties. And it doesn't make the South happy, because they know that there's like this Underground Railroad going on. They're like, how are these slaves escaping all the way to Canada? You Northerners are cheating. You're not playing by the rules. Right? And so once again, the distinction between North and South, the separation continues. It grows even more. Okay. I've mentioned to you John Brown before. Now, of course, John Brown, when you guys watch the little video assignment I'm going to give you, I'm going to have you watch a little bit of Ken Burns' The Cause. There's this old grumpy historian in there that they interview. His name's Ed Bears. Isn't that a great name, Ed Bears? Bears, like plural bears. And when you get to it, you'll know, because he's just like, John Brown. John Brown is a crazy man. Leader of the war. Oh, man, I wish I could be a grumpy old man like that someday. And we've already talked about John Brown. Remember, he hacked those guys to death with broadswords. He's got a plan. I'm going to share with you his plan and see if you think it's a smart thing. So he's going to become a hero, not because of the hacking the people apart, but rather because he's defeated the Missourian ruffians in this little skirmish, and he goes to the north, and he's raising money. And he's raising money, doesn't tell everyone exactly what he's doing. He's raising money as an abolitionist, but what for? Here's his plan. Tell me if you think it's smart. He's going to take a group of abolitionists, fairly small, with limited military training, including some of his sons, and he's going to invade the South. He's going to attack an armory and grab a whole bunch of guns. The local slaves are going to hear about his attack on this armory, and they're going to rush to join him, the abolitionist, to destroy slavery and the devil and all his minions. And from there, the slaves are going to join, and he's going to do this at Harper's Ferry, by the way. He's going to join with the slaves who are running away in droves to join his army. And he's going to march along the crest of the Appalachian Mountains as the slaves are all leaving to create this huge slave army and destroy slavery in the bowels of the South. What do you guys think? How many of you are like, good plan? Don't see that. Yeah, good plan. That's going to work well. Anyone? How many of you are like, that's going to be a disaster? Okay, if you voted for disaster, you were right. It was absolutely atrocious. The slaves did not rise up. Angry townspeople did, and the army was called in, led by Robert E. Lee, as he does this at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. The armory is surrounded. The first person killed is a freed black person. There's a guy named somebody newbie, has his ears cut off. He's a black guy who gets killed. The townspeople cut off his ears as souvenirs. Messed up stuff like that's going on here during this. John Brown's uprising is a complete disaster, very unsuccessful, but it scared the poo out of the South. Like they were just, what kind of a crazy Northerner would do this? Like, just leave us alone, people. Let us have our slaves. And yet you have this Northern guy that actually tries to do this. He was executed. Ed Bears is going to call him the meteor of the war. John Brown, there's even a song about him. You guys might know the song. Actually, you probably know the tune. John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave, but his truth keeps marching on. How many of you know the tune? Okay. How many of you knew that that's the original lyrics? Yeah, that's a Northern anti-slavery song. Yeah, John Brown's truth keeps marching on, right? Though his body is moldering after he's executed, his truth keeps marching on. Okay, by 1860, the Whig Party has folded. The Republican Party is growing in popularity, and this is the fatal split. This is the straw that breaks the camel's back. Many of the Southern Democrats felt the Northern Democrats were, well, not pro-slavery enough, and so the party splits into two. And because a party splits into two, even if you have a majority party and it splits into two versus another one, that other one's going to win. And so Abraham Lincoln, who's not even on the ballot in the South, like no one in Georgia is going to vote for Abraham Lincoln. No one, not one person. He's not even on the ballot. He's not on the ballot in any of the Deep South, and yet he wins. Now, how would you feel if, say, Donald Trump or Joe Biden was so unpopular here in the United States that they didn't, or in Oregon, that they didn't even make it on our ballot, and yet they won? Would you be like, yeah, he's our president. He wasn't even on the ballot. See the problem with that? And so when that happens, and immediately thereafter, now keep in mind that Abraham Lincoln was just kind of like a compromise candidate who was put on the ballot because they couldn't decide on any of the other Republicans. And so there he is. He's back there in Illinois, twiddling his thumbs. A girl wrote him a letter and said, your face is ugly, you should grow a beard, cover that up. And he said, okay, and he grew a beard. That's what he did during this time. All he did was grow a beard. He didn't have any power until he takes office. And so that means Buchanan's still sitting there, doing typically what Buchanan does, nothing. And so South Carolina secedes, the rest of the Deep South secedes. They pick Jefferson Davis, the Confederacy does, as their president. And then it's not until March that Abraham Lincoln takes the oath of office, and more states join then. And so there you have it. That is how the Civil War gets going. And then Abraham Lincoln is dealing with this difficult choice, like, what do I do now? Do I try to bring the South back in? Do I make them promises? Do I get fighting started? If I attack the South, if I send my army down to the South and attack the South, it's going to make me look like the aggressor. And then England's probably going to support the South. And if England supports the South, that's not good for the Union. So Abraham Lincoln has to deal with all this and say, well, how can we preserve the Union and do it in a way so that it's just us fighting a civil war rather than this becoming like an international war? And we'll be looking at that next time. Okay, so that's what I have for you guys today. If there are any questions, feel free to stay on. Otherwise, I will see many of you on Thursday.
Thank you.